Hello, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mengs, and I welcome you guys back to another episode of Unit Analysis, the series where we review units from the Advanced Wars games and take a look at them in great detail. And in today's episode, we'll be taking a look at the Recon. This was by far one of the most requested comments I saw in the comment section of the earlier episode that I did. A lot of you guys want to know more about Recons, and it's interesting, the Recon is a very simple unit. It's not very hard to figure out what it does, but I think maybe it is one of the most misused units, at least among early beginners, because it is a unit that a lot of people just send out to get scouting information, then they lose it, and they don't really utilize it anymore. They build a few in the early game, and then they stop building them. And I think a lot of people, if they learn how to utilize Recons better, this will definitely improve their play. But first, let's talk about some basics. The Recon costs 4,000, it's only slightly more than a mech, so it's very cheap, which means you can build it very early on. But that doesn't necessarily mean you should always open up with a Recon. In fact, I see a lot of people open up tank, at least in the competitive Advanced Wars scene. This seems to be a lot more of a favorable opener. Very few people actually open up with Recon. They tend to build a tank first, maybe even two tanks, and then they go into a Recon later on. Because scouting will always be important. So, speaking of what the Recon does, it's obviously a scout. It is the fastest vehicle in the entire game. It has 8 move. It is almost as fast as a fighter, so that should tell you something. However, it does move on tires. Now, while it can move insanely far, it can only do so on roads and properties, because of course, tires are the worst movement type in Advanced Wars. While the Recon is incredibly fast on roads, it is not equally fast on plains. As we can see right here, it has a movement of 4 when moving across plains, which is still pretty effective for a vehicle on tires. And even in forest, it can move 2 squares, which, is also still pretty impressive for a unit on tires. If you have a slight movement increase, like from Adder's Little Power, giving it +1 movement, it can move 3 squares, because of course that puts this movement up to 9. It pays 3 movement cost to go across forest, so that's 369. So if you're playing with a CO that has a bit of a movement increase, such as Adder, Jess, or other COs, then you can move a Recon a little bit faster. And that definitely is nice, because one of the Recon's strengths, I would say, is hiding in forests and gathering intel on your opponent. This is definitely one of the things it does the most. Again, it has 5 vision, the most out of any unit in the game, aside from submarines and missiles, which ties it. And this allows the Recon to scout whether or not a big scary army is approaching you. So it's definitely very important to keep your Recons alive and use them for scouting. When you lose your Recons, you lose your sight, and that means you have to build a new one. And while they aren't terribly expensive at 4,000, you still don't want to have to build another one. So, however, scouting is not the only thing that the Recon is good at. It is also incredibly strong against enemy infantry units, dealing 70% base damage. That is almost as much as a tank that deals 75%. So if you can catch an enemy infantry out in the open, they'll usually get wiped out pretty quickly. Now, before I continue, I want to specify, a lot of people will mention this if I don't. While I am showcasing this playing as Jess, I am turning off powers for these presentations, so all the units shown in this video will be at 100% normal day-to-day power. They won't be any stronger or weaker. Even though I'm playing Jess versus Colin, this is primarily for visuals and nothing else. So, as you can see, Recons are pretty strong against infantry. They're even pretty strong against mechs, dealing 65% damage. They will take a little bit of damage back in return though, so you need to be a little bit careful when dealing with them. The Recon is also pretty good at interrupting captures. As you can see right here, it does 49% damage to an infantry on a property, so if you can catch an infantry out in the open, you will usually always take 5 damage. But in some very rare situations, like you actually saw here, I was very glad that happened actually, because that is very rare. But they can also deal 4 HP of damage, because of course, if you know anything about Advanced Wars, there's a slight luck modifier. So the Recon will actually do 49 to 55% damage against the infantry, meaning that you have a very slight chance, as happened here, to only do 4 HP of damage. And this is something you have to keep in mind when interrupting caps. Be aware that there's a very small chance that you might do a little bit less damage than you think. Of course, if I were to play with Jess in this situation and have a small firepower increase, then this wouldn't be something I would need to worry about. But still, it's something you definitely have to keep in mind. The Recon does pretty well against mechs, as I said. You want to be cautious about attacking them when they're in a fortified position. If you do that, the mechs will take very little damage and strike back. But still, you shouldn't be too worried about this. Keep in mind that the mech and the Recon are almost tied in costs, so it's not like it's a huge loss for you. But you definitely want to be cautious about mechs attacking your Recon, because if mechs get the first strike, they will almost wipe them out completely. So be cautious, stay clear of enemy forests or forests in Fog of War, because there might have mechs hiding inside them, and just be very careful. When you go out to harass infantry with your Recon units, you want to be cautious. You want to make sure you don't have any mechs get the jump on you, because that is a very good engagement for the mechs. So be careful with your Recons, send them out to scout, send them out to harass, but don't suicide them into tanks or anything like that. Speaking of tanks against Recons, tanks are pretty much the best counter. If anyone is opening up and harassing you with early game Recons, the best response to this is usually not mechs, because they can't catch the Recon most of the time. The best response you have to this is a tank. Tanks are incredibly strong against Recons, completely wiping them out. If you have a small firepower increase, they can pretty much one-shot them. Same thing goes for medium tanks and neo tanks. Medium tanks do 105% base damage, so they will always one-shot the Recon unless they have some small manner of defense. Neo tanks are even more ridiculous. They do 125% damage, so you want to be very careful about that. Of course, if your Recons are getting taken out by Neo tanks, chances are you're probably into the late game, and you shouldn't have your Recons out in the open anyway. Battlecopters are not that great against Recons, actually. They only deal 55% damage, so it's not the end of the world if you happen to have a Battlecopter poke out and take a shot at your Recons. Still, it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world either. However, one thing that the Recons do very well is fighting indirects. This is another one of their primary uses. Whenever you're going up against CEOs like Grit, or anyone that likes to hide behind a wall of indirects, getting out some Recons to harass those indirects can be very good. And of course, good players will shield their indirects with infantry, but if you happen to catch them out into the open, then you can actually do a fair bit of damage to them. Recons do 45% base damage to artillery. Of course, artillery are very rarely caught out on roads. Most of the time, an artillery will be either in a wood or in a city, so it won't be that much. But still, one of the best engagements that a Recon can take is against a rocket. They do 55% base damage to rockets, so if they can catch them out in the open, this is an incredibly effective engagement. Basically makes the Recon earn itself in twice over in terms of cost effectiveness, and just being able to cripple a rocket like that is incredibly good. Of course, as I said, rockets most often encountered in woods where the Recon isn't super mobile, but it's still something to keep in mind. Now, if you watched my first episode where I reviewed the missile, you would know that the Recon actually isn't good against the missile. I mean, it still does damage to it, but only 28%, which is very strange. So it does 2 to 3 HP of damage to the missile. For some reason, the missile is just very resistant to Recon fire for some reason. I don't really know why. Against itself in a mirror matchup, a Recon deals 35% damage, so if two Recons meet each other out when they're out scouting, chances are they won't really do much to each other. Oh, we got the glitch, you guys saw that? We got the special Jest glitch, where you get the big Recon turning the other way around. That's very rare. I still don't know what happens. So yeah, if two Recons meet each other, they're not very likely to do a lot, so most of the time they'll just end up ignoring each other and just rush past each other. So not something you really need to worry about. But yes, as you can see, the Recon, it's primarily a scouter and a harasser, but it can also deal with indirects if it happens to catch them out into the open. They are very vulnerable to indirects though. The rocket deals 90% base damage to Recons, just not enough to one-shot it reliably, but unless you're fighting against a CO like Grit, for example, or in this case Jess, who gets a small firepower increase. Artillery also murders them, so you gotta be very careful when approaching heavily fortified positions with rockets. Enemies will very often shoot on them with indirects if they're within range, and that pretty much turns the rocket useless. Or does it? This is what most people think, and this is what annoys me when I see people utilizing rockets in games. So let's say you do have a 1 HP rocket, or sorry, a 1 HP Recon. Now what a lot of people will do is they'll either use it as a shield, or they'll simply suicide it into a unit. But what you should be doing, if you have a weakened Recon, is you need to use it for scouting. Because here's the thing, a 1 HP Recon has just as much vision as a 10 HP Recon. So how you utilize Recons is you send them out, you harass, you do whatever you can with them, and then when they're injured, if you're lucky enough to keep them alive, you pull them back and you use them for scouting. Or even better, you can utilize something that I call the sneaky infiltration Recon. If you happen to get a Recon behind enemy lines, into a forest, of course this is primarily useful in Fog of War, you can get them into such a position where you can scout what the enemy is building. If you can get your Recon into such a position, it is a game-winning move. Many of you have probably seen this during my streams with Panzergraf. I am very fond of putting a Recon in the woods behind the enemy base. If you can get your Recon into a position where you can see their bases, and even more importantly, their airports, you can perfectly decipher when enemy units are coming in. If you can see what the enemy is building, that gives you such a huge advantage. You can see every time they decide to build a battlecopter or even a bomber, and you can prepare a missile or an anti-air perfectly in response. Simply by counting how many turns they'll take to move into the middle, you'll be able to see perfectly when they'll be coming into the middle, so you can build a perfect counter unit. And again, that gives you such an advantage. So whenever you're playing Fog of War, you do well to occasionally scout forests around your base. You know, just build a battlecopter or a Recon of your own, and just move them through the bases. Even though it costs you a little bit of fuel, you can still scout multiple forests with one unit if you know what you're doing, because of course, with a single unit, you can do this. Although, be careful that this will cost you fuel in Fog of War, and if you do it repeatedly, you will run out of fuel eventually. So you can see now I have 30 fuel. Now I have 14 fuel. So every time you do this, it actually drains your fuel, and it will keep doing that until your unit is completely empty. So you can't do this forever, but you can do a little bit. So if I were to play a map like this, I would occasionally build a Recon or a battlecopter, and I would just scout these forests every now and then to make sure there wasn't an enemy Recon hiding in them, because that is always a very strong play if you can do it. And most players do not have the awareness to do this, so if you can first get a Recon into this position, most likely it will stay there for the entire match and just provide you with so much valuable info. So just keep this in mind. Do not sacrifice your rockets, or Recons. God damn it, they sound so similar. Don't sacrifice your Recons. Keep them alive and use them for scouting. That way you don't have to build new Recons, which are basically 4,000 gold down the drain, which you could have spent on other units. And this is what I mean when I say most people don't utilize their Recons correctly. They get them killed, they have to build new ones. And especially when you play on Fog of War, it is so important to always have 1 or 2 Recons on the field, because of course with units like medium tanks and neo tanks, they may be strong, but they're completely worthless on their own in Fog of War because they have one vision, so they're completely reliant on Recons to scout out. Alternatively, if you have a lot of mountains on the map, you can put infantry in the mountains, but they're stationary and can never move away from those mountains unless they want to lose their vision. So this isn't a great response, but it is maybe a substitute in certain maps. But can Recons be utilized outside of Fog of War? I would say yes, although their usefulness is certainly a lot less. Recons are still one of the best units for interrupting caps, at least for a cheap cost, so if there are a lot of infantry and roads on the map and a lot of captures taking place, I would definitely build some Recons in the mid-game just to interrupt caps. Also, alternatively, to try and pressure enemy indirects. So even without Fog of War, there's definitely still merit for building Recons, but it's not as much as in Fog of War. They're primarily a Fog of War unit, but that doesn't mean they should never be built outside of it, just that they're a little bit less useful. But overall, you don't want to be spamming Recons. Recons are a support unit, that's usually what they're best for. Your main army should primarily consist of tanks, battlecopters, and infantry, with a couple of Recons supporting them up. However, if you do happen to get all your Recons killed, you should still build a few more to replace them. As you always, on a general rule, you want at least 1 Recon, at least 2 Recons in a big match, so that you can scout large parts of the map. So that's pretty much all I have to say regarding Recons. What do you guys think about Recons? Do you think they're fine just the way they are, or would you wish they would be changed in any way? And yeah, what kind of unit would you like to see me cover in the next episode of this series? Let me know that in the comment section below. Leave a like and subscribe for more Advanced Wars content. And if not that, just at least leave a like for Recon Sean. I mean, come on, look how adorable she is. Anyway, my name is Mangs. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.